Okay, we were talking about the NATO strategy in Africa, and for a strategy, the first thing was strategy objectives. I mentioned two of them. For me, the main one is to get the Russians out of Africa, and the second one is to prevent Russia moving toward the West and to get access to the Atlantic Ocean. Not all the countries, but maybe some countries, eastern countries from Benin and Togo to Mauritania. The second point is, okay, let's learn about the Russians and the Chinese. What about their strategies that we can use in NATO? For instance, if we look at the Russians, they issued in March 2023 what they call the new foreign affairs concept of the Russian Federation, where the presidency, Mr. Putin or President Putin, states very clearly which is Russian purposes in the whole world, but specifically in Africa. And he says in this concept that the new world order has been altered, okay, that the changes has not been well received by Western powers that are accustomed to the logic of global dominion and colonialism. And Russia should pursue the doctrine of objective perception of Russian abroad to counter campaigns of anti-Russian propaganda conducted systematically by hostile states, implying disinformation, defamation, and hatred. So actually, the Russians are blaming us exactly the same that we are blaming them. But that's not important. What is important is that at the highest level of the Russian Federation, at the level of the presidency, they have a clear idea of what Russia should do in the world, and specifically in Africa. We in NATO, we should have the same, a clear idea of what NATO wants to do in Africa. Okay, so that's the objectives. We need also capabilities and a way to use these capabilities to achieve these objectives. We can use better than the Russians. For me, it's better structure the Chinese strategy. The Chinese strategy is more subtle than the Russian one. And if you look to the many speeches by the president of China, Mr. Xi Jinping, and also by the Chinese authorities themselves, they have three main objectives or three main ways of achieving their objectives. The objectives for China are quite similar to the Russian, but a little bit different. They are going as a final objective to challenge the Western rules-based order. Okay, we know that we are in the sort of strategic competition. They want to improve the image of China in Africa, and this is at the level of the Chinese presidency. So everything, all the apparatus of the state is going in this direction. They want to get accepted by local elites, African elites, a Chinese narrative regarding Taiwan, Tibet, or the South Chinese Sea, and they are working on that direction. And of course, they want to improve and to get a better image of Africa, of China in Africa, in order to promote Chinese interests, specifically economic interest. The Chinese strategy is more focused on the economic domain right now. Maybe in the future will be more military, because you know that in history, sometimes first come the armies and later on the merchants, and some ways it's the other way around. The Chinese first the traders and negotiators and merchants, and after that maybe the armies will come, as it's already happening in Djibouti. So they have a clear idea of how to get there. And how are the Chinese do that we can learn from them? They say, okay, first point, to train journalists and elites. We have talked here or discussed a lot about training the journalists. Okay, it's not only the journalists. We have to train the journalists, and we have to train also the elites. With elites, it's a bit dangerous, because you know that we train elites, African elites in Europe. At the end of the day, they remain in Europe. They don't go back to their country and develop their countries. So we have to focus on certain elites. Journalism is critical, because we have mentioned, I fully agree that the message, our narrative has to be sold out in Africa by African themselves, not by ourselves or our journalists, but also some political elites and some even military elites. We can train them either in Europe or we can train in their own countries. And we have, NATO has excellent, for instance, the Center of Excellence we were talking before with some of our colleagues. We can provide excellent training for African elites on critical domains that NATO has a lot of expertise. We can use this as a practical tool to help the Africans. And finally, we should put more money, absolutely. For instance, the Chinese, only in the year 2017, they invested more than 10 billion US dollars only in media outlets in Africa. We don't have that money, and that's it's not the purpose of NATO to do that, because NATO is, at the end of the day, is a military alliance with some, let's say, limited capabilities in other domains. For me, the main responsibility should be transferred from NATO to the European Union. NATO is right now focusing in Ukraine. All the attention of NATO is in Ukraine. In the last NATO summit in Madrid, where the strategic concept was approved in June 2022, NATO said very clearly, NATO is back to collective defense. Okay, let's put NATO in collective defense. So who should take the lead? For me, it should be the European Union, because the European Union has better toolbox to do that. It's not only military, but also has economical, diplomatic, etc. capabilities to tackle African problems. Because what we have learned from the past experience is that when we put boots on the ground, so NATO is always failing. We failed in Afghanistan, the same in Libya, etc. And there is no appetite, and we noticed that, and probably you will agree with that, or most of you would agree, that there is no appetite in NATO capitals and NATO elites to deploy troops on the terrain, having in mind the experience from the past. But the European Union is looking forward to be, let's say, a global power. Okay, this is a good opportunity to prove it with facts, not with your mouth. And so what about NATO and the European Union? For many years, there was a mistrust between NATO and European Union. The EU didn't want to cooperate with NATO because the Europeans thought that will contaminate, at the end of the day, the European Union. But now we have reached a point in the history of both institutions that we have to cooperate closer, And the European Union has some good tools. For instance, it has the compass, the strategic compass that was approved in 2022, which provides some tools, useful tools to be employed in Africa. The Chinas have invested heavily in what they call the Chinese, the Big Four, the news agency, the Xinhua, the China Daily, the China Radio International, and the China Global TV Network. Okay, we should do the same. We should invest more heavily in these four domains, and we should put more money in this effort. What I want to try, and I'm finishing here, what I want to try is that we have reached a moment that we cannot disconnect from African problems. We have to get the African parameters, the African needs and requirements into our own strategic equation. It's not only Ukraine, it's not only China, it's Africa. It was mentioned before that Africa in this sort of hybrid environment, it's not only direct wars, hybrid environments. Africa is one of the main and probably the most principal scenarios where this fight between the Western nations and the autocratic nation is being played. We need to win this battle, because otherwise, if we lose Africa, probably we will lose the battle against the Russian and especially the Chinese.
Thank you, Ignatius. Andrew, you gave him some of your time. So
I'm generous.
I will now give you 2 minutes so that I can use a minute and summarize.
I only need one. I mean, Ignacio raised a lot of very interesting points. I'll start with what the general said. I totally agree with you. My first point is that we need to take a step back and think about how we understand what we expect and what we can offer to the Sahel region. if I look briefly past to the history of NATO, and this is a point I kind of agree with your comments about whether EU is a more proper institution, whether NATO is used in doing certain things. I think that what NATO has done in the post-Cold War period, it survived, it expanded, it transformed into a more bigger, let's say, institution doing more things apart from the defense, obviously, more security oriented. So there is still ground, more things for NATO to do, but I agree with you that, of course, the European Union has a more socio-political, economic background and can offer a lot of things. Another skepticism for your comment is that obviously now we are, let's say, pretty much occupied with Ukraine. Ignacio mentioned that as well. We see Ukraine, the problem with Ukraine and Russia obviously as an existential threat. It makes sense because you have a war near our borders, but Africa and Sahel, let's be more specific, is also maybe a more long-term existential problem for us in terms of what would happen, in terms of migration, security, jihad. I don't need to elaborate more on that. And my final point is that I didn't mention that earlier in terms of the information environment and spreading the message. We also have to think, actually at the same time, our domestic public opinion. This is a message we have to think, not only like we have to convince the Sahel or we have to convince other partners, we have to convince first ourselves and our domestic public opinion about the need to do certain things, more things for the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Fidel, do you want
Yes,
to?
sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So thank you very much for the opportunity. One contributor mentioned the academia, very important. Now, I had my first degree at the University of Ghana. And while there was a space that was more of a green belt. It was grass and surrounded by ornamental plants and all that. Currently, they have erected a Confucian Institute that is sponsored by China, a very magnificent building. And obviously, they are not going to promote Western ideas or Western interests. They are going to promote Chinese interests in that building. Recently, I granted an interview to DWTV, the German international broadcaster, and I asked that we stood in front of that building so that the message can get across, asking why Russia is able to recruit Africans and Chinese are able to recruit African academics and all that. And then we stood there and we did that. If it gets into full force, it means my university is going to become a center for Chinese ideas and things that promote that. Equally, the West can establish something of this nature in the same university, as long as it sponsors this infrastructure and pay and is able to sponsor the academic budget of that institute. It would work. And everything starts in the brain. And when the brain is captured, everything else follows. So that is very important to look at. Then about fact checking. I have a mate who is currently in charge of a fact check Ghana, who they do fact checking, but mostly is concentrated in local politics. On the other hand, I created DefSec Analytics Africa last year. It was supposed to look at defense and security issues in Africa. But it was just last year, and we don't have that funding to run the organization. So currently we are still talking around and you can't sell these ideas to everyone. You need, confidence building and partners you can trust. So that is to put it out there for anyone who will be interested to partner. And so this is very important. Again, there was the issue of Agadez. When after the coup in Niger, Agadez, there was a pact between Niger and the European Union to stop the flow of migrants across the Sahara. Just after the coup and Niger moving towards Russia, this agreement was abrogated unilaterally. This means that, in fact, it was a clear sabotage of the European Union and other, the security concerns of Europe. So these are some of the things that happens when there is that kind of space for Russia and China to operate. And so I think that there should be more proactive measures to stop some of these things. So the main point here is the Confucian Institute and what we can do about some of these things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So
can I have just a comment? Okay. Very brief to what Fidel, because I relate to what Fidel said. I will very briefly say a short story. I am a professor in the University of Piraeus. For those that do not know, Piraeus is the harbor of Athens. In Piraeus, we have Costco, suppose you all know, this big Chinese company. And I think it was like 10 or 12 years ago that our university had an offer to have the Confucius Institute. And the university thought wisely back then that we have Costco in the harbor. If we have Confucius, maybe that is too much, being too pro-Chinese. I think you get my point. So then another university, I'm not going to say the name, has a Confucius Institute in Athens. So I relate to that. And because Fidel also mentioned about the role of academia, I will just give an example. I think everybody within NATO can relate to that. When I teach about NATO, I spend like an hour debating whether the proper term after NATO, what has happened after post-Cold War era, is NATO's enlargement or NATO's expansions. And I trick my students and I look at the map and show them the map, describe me, how do you think? And then I have to explain that, the context of enlargement and the context of expansion are very different. Expansion is a very, let's say, not a positive term to describe certain things. It's just a game I do with my students. It's just relating to what Fidel was thinking. Thank you for the time.
Thank you so much. Just as a summary, which I will just do in 1 minute. First, to say that one critical issue that came out from this discussion that we had on this topic is, what are we doing? What is NATO doing? Strategy, strategy, strategy. And it's very clear. There was a question the director asked, which to me meant two things. One is, what does Russia and China want? What does NATO want? And what does the Sahel want? So for NATO to understand that, first, from yesterday, we understood what China and Russia wants. Economic resources. Is that what NATO and the countries of NATO want? If that's what they want, that's not bad. Africa is not going to eat their resources. They're going to work with someone with their resources. So it means negotiate with them and pay them what you need to pay with them. It's business. There was an American firm that came to Nigeria and wanted to start getting access to one of Nigerian resources. The statement, we will not sell to you. We want you to establish at least a plant so that we can get the people here employed. They pulled out. So these are some of the issues. So these are some of the things we need to understand and find a way around it. For sure, that's one thing that we know, that most African states are ready to work with NATO. They are ready to work with EU states. They are ready to work with the Western. But it's about being able to understand each other and find a common agreement. And that, I think, is important. Fidel just said what I wanted to say, but I will say it in one language. There are so many centers of African studies in Europe, but I can't remember of any university in Nigeria with Center of European Studies. There are so many Europeans who are African experts. I studied in the University of Birmingham, and I lived in Birmingham for 20 years. I don't know if I would say I'm an European expert. It's very important that we start changing some of these things. And these are the things China is cashing in on. I know a lot of my friends who studied in China under their scholarship. When I go on debate with them, they are like almost apostles of Chinese development. They do not even allow you to talk, because then, while I was paying my fees and all that at University of Birmingham, they did it free. So these are very key important issues that NATO and EU need to start considering. And another issue that came out here, and Andrew and Ignatius, he came out very well to explain it. There's a kind of confusion between NATO and allying institutions that are linked to NATO, like the EU and so on. They need to put their acts together and know that we have a common agenda. And how do we drive it? NATO could have the strategic plan, but those strategic plans need to be bought by the other, like the EU, and know how to drive it. 3 years ago, we tried to do something in the Sahel. Myself and one of my partners went and met Nigerian former president, Goodluck Jonathan, and we sold an idea to him. We said, why can't you champion an idea to get Sahel to work? I said, that is your Nobel Peace Prize if you can do it. He said, but nobody will support me. We sat down and we saw there are so many initiatives by the EU, by the West going on in Sahel, but they don't align together. So everybody is doing what everybody wants to do. So these are areas where you need to start putting those ideas together. There are ones the European Union is doing that is headquartered with GIZ at a time by the German government. You find the one the British government is doing. Everybody is just doing their own thing. Putting those efforts together might be another way of start tackling this issue. Thank you. And we'll move to the second panel. So the second panel is we're going to look at understanding information flow, dissemination, and information disorder. Like we did yesterday, most of these issues are very clear to us, but because we have other subject experts here, we're going to expand it, get thoughts, get contribution from our friends here, just to begin to put ideas, put recommendation, and so that at the end of the day, we'll walk out here and say, after the 2 days, I left having this in my mind. I left understanding the information flow and how we can work out and tackle them. I think that's the main issue. And like we did in the first minute, we're going to give 3 minutes to each of the experts. But this time around, I'm not going to start with those here. I'm going to start with those online. So Beverly, you have the first shot.
Thank you for that. I mean, as we have just highlighted, one of the most important things is how people are able to access information within the region. And we've noted that in as much as a lot of it has been happening online in the online space, people still very much use raw form broadcast media across the region to be able to interact, to have a better understanding of the world around them. They hear it in their own languages, which makes it resonate with them. And these are areas that are still worth tapping into. When I look at, for instance, program summaries coming from Niger, the main concerns tend to be obviously the security situation, which is the obvious point, and then they move on to politics, and it moves on to what are the day-to-day needs, where can you get the easiest, if it's rice, where the price is down, a bag of cement and things like that. So it's important to still look at where those flows of information are impacting people the most. And then at what point is that information, the integrity of the information being compromised? And that's when we have influential local actors who are acting at the behest of external powers. Those links tend to be very difficult to delineate, but I think there's been lots of investigations into that to understand how it is that China or Russia, for instance, would be able to find someone, as Fidelis pointed out, academics or local leaders, religious leaders, civil society groups that then go on to preach a certain side of information. I think just briefly touching on something that someone had asked about, it was Africa Stream, which is, yes, a very anti-imperialist platform. It did come out that it was being sponsored by Russia. It was taken out by the majority of social media platforms, save for Twitter, or X as it calls itself, because it sees itself as a free speech absolutist. Sometimes it's important to look at those flows of information to know what kind of alternative things are being said. But I think quick action by large media companies on taking that down or debunking it is important. And then at a very localized level, one of the things I do remember the UN radio used to do was they would run a fact check program like it was a conversational thing. So the presenter of the program would have a guest come in. It could be a community leader, it could be a social media expert, it could be a journalist. And they'd start off by saying something like, did you see this image which was being shared, which claimed that French forces were giving terrorists weapons? And then the person would sort of engage with it. And that personalized way of sharing that information is partly what made it impactful. But of course, in the long run, we did see that they were pushed out. But the resilience of clear information systems is really important in environments where that integrity is constantly being compromised.
Thank you so much. Fidel, over to you.
Yeah. Yes. So, not long ago, someone came to my inbox on LinkedIn, and then he asked that, how come my name is Fidel and I seem to be too pro-Western? That's what he said. And then, I knew it was psychological way of getting to me. And I said, yes, my name is Fidel, but I like the truth. And eventually I had to block him because, I don't tolerate such conversations for a long time, especially when I see that you are trying to question my intelligence and all that. So that is some of the ways that these things flow. Now, one thing that I would say is that, there is this kind of pervasive use of phones, and many youth have access to phones. So one thing is, when it comes to access, or your gadget, the gadget the person is using. So many youth have moved from traditional media to social media. So we say, well, it's been long since I switched on my television to actually listen to mainstream news. So what they do is they go to social media, and there's TikTok, where people use AI to say all kinds of things, and they do believe these things. Now, this has created a spectrum of information flows. And you realize that even in mainstream media, there are some journalists who, over time, buy into such fake news because they've been repeated over time. And so you find journalists asking questions, and you ask yourself, why didn't he find out? So France is supplying weapons to terrorists, as Beverly mentioned. And this is so much believed by so many people who are supposed to know better. And they will say, well, France is sponsoring terrorism. That is how come when France left the Sahel, the security situation has deteriorated. So I asked them, what happened after 2012 when terror groups took over the region? It was Operation Sahel that actually halted the movement of terror groups in the region. And Operation Sahel was initiated by France. Yes, post-colonial French policy may have some flaws, but the fact remains that the French intervention in 2012-2013 was very instrumental in stopping the tentacles of these terrorists from reaching Bamako and other important urban centers, together with ECOWAS support. Today, ECOWAS is seen as Western creation, and France is, I think, the worst evil in the region. People say all kinds of things. So the thing is how these things flow and how we are able to decipher that, to tell that this is coming from this way, how to stop it. Yes, X will continue to say they are absolutely for freedom of speech and other things, and that will leave to Western government to deal with that because it's actually causing more harm. On TikTok, we see all kinds of images that are springing up, and people are championing narratives that are non-existent. And so we have to look at this and see how we are able to see the differences and tackle them consequentially. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. So we'll start with our panelists here. Aisha, I'll start with you now. I like catching people off guard. Probably that's when they produce their best.
Completely off guard. Talking about information flow, there was a research a few years ago by a think tank network of African, actually ANI. They were trying to, bring together African media organization. And then what would notice in the research is most information that Africans actually consume comes from the West, and mainly from RFI and BBC. And we know that these are owned by the respective governments, and also they have an agenda. So when OAU existed, before AU, there was the PANAPRESS, the Pan-African News Agency, which is, if it has not died, it's about to die for years for lack of funding. They're based in Dakar. There was another project, African Press Agency, which also tried actually to have news from the continent, and news agency diversified, video, etc. But the main issue is funding. It's not it's heavy. It's not bringing enough benefits as a business model. So as long as we in the continent do not consume information that's produced by us, for us, in an unbiased way, like the normal journalistic, processing of information, there will always be this blatant or subtle attempt to influence opinions. And when we set up Africtivist, when internet was a thing from 2007 going on, we were bloggers, and we were trying to, write, contribute. It can be videos on YouTube, it can be written, and try to tell the stories of our people. Now that has changed, because the most used platforms have changed. You have TikTok. There's still some people who have who produce actually good content. You have some people on Twitter who produce content, and someone mentioned yesterday citizen journalists. Citizen journalists play a big role actually in information flow, but also in fighting disinformation and misinformation in the continent. My impression is you have less and less of them, because they tend to become influencers once they have a huge following, because being a citizen journalist requires certain ethics and also certain skills. One of the programs that we piloted last year, and we had some people from the Sahel countries, the core Sahel, come to Dakar, and were trained to be community citizen journalists. They will be investigating issues in their communities and provide the information, the right information to their communities. But the issue we have, these people have these skills, but they cannot use it because of the security, the risk actually they run if they were to tackle those issues. So there are ways actually of, having clear information flow, being able to trace it back at the local level. But the context is very important. In some setup, when I take the example of Mali, some of the cultures in Mali usually have a household leader who in development projects is usually the entry point to pass information through. Because whatever the household leader says, the rest of the family will follow. And this term of household leader is not just the father of a given family, is you have a group of families, and then you have maybe the father with his son and their families. And, the information that comes from this person is considered a reliable information. And these people actually could be entry points, maybe indirectly, and also religious organizations. It can be imams, it can be priests. They play a big role actually in feeding information to communities. In our work, specifically in Senegal and Gambia, we tap into the regional communities a lot, because most surveys that are done shows that people believe more in the religious leaders than in the state. There's been a distrust between the citizens and the state, from before independence, and it has continued after independence. So that distrust, those who came after independence have not tried to resolve that, and it's something that's continuing. So religious leaders are definitely, I will insist again, an entry point that could be used. So those were the three I wanted to mention: community citizen journalists, religious leaders, and head of households.
Thank you so much.